Good morning. And first of all, thank you to organizers for inviting me and for such a brilliant organization of the event. And before I start, it's important to mention that I'm not a professional writer, academical theoretician, etc. I'm just artist, and all what I want to present today appeared as kind of outcome of my artistic practice and my artistic research. And I'd like to speak today on one of my texts that was written 5 or 6 years ago, and it has a certain level of optimism towards Marxist museology and possibility of reintroducing it into contemporary art practices. Today my position has slightly changed, but anyway, I guess it's important and interesting to discuss some points from this. Bourgeois culture as a ready-made, first part of this text. In the first years after the 1917 revolution, cultural production wasn't among the priority tasks of the Bolshevik party for obvious reasons. The country found itself in the state of civil war and was constantly anticipating foreign intervention. The memories of People's Commissar Anatoly Lunacharsky, you may see him here with Lenin, the man who was essentially responsible for the cultural policies of the newborn proletarian state, contains the words of advice he received from Lenin upon his appointment. Quote, "I do not have time right now to give you various instructions regarding your new responsibilities. Nor can I claim that I have any profoundly elaborate system of thoughts with regard to the first steps of the revolution in educational matters. But one thing is clear, though. A great deal of things must be totally turned over, revamped and set on a new course. However, it was precisely during this time that within the system of cultural production, as yet loosely organized and uncontrolled by the ruling party, quite a few radically innovative phenomena took shape that greatly influenced the evolution of the 20th century art. An important but now forgotten part of the post-revolutionary cultural landscape was constituted by an army of unprofessional artists, poets, writers from the working class who came together under the common name of prolet cult. Self-taught poets, many of them even illiterate, who composed their works literally on the factory floor, had also existed before the revolution, but for good reason were perceived as a marginal part of the literary spectrum. After the events of 1917, due to the support of new ideology, prolet cult became the laboratory where both the strategy and the tactics of Soviet cultural production got elaborated. The originality of prolet cult was based on the ideological principles determined primarily by Lenin's opponent within the Bolshevik party, Alexander Bogdanov. Bogdanov right now is becoming more and more visible, especially within the discussion on accelerationist movement and some Marxist techno-utopian heresies. In Bogdanov's opinion, it's a collective labor that provides the means for creating an organized world from chaos. It was his one of the main idea that nature itself and our planet itself is kind of worker that all the time self-organize itself through producing new being, let's say. And in this respect, the key role in this process is given to the proletariat. Bogdanov points to the unconditional aspiration of the working class for self-organization, which also becomes a natural basis for his cultural program. But spontaneous self-organization alone is not enough for building socialism. The process of creating a new historical entity has to be enhanced with awareness. According to Bogdanov, social revolution must be preceded by the preparatory stage of the proletariat's formation as a class, culminating in its understanding of its own mission. As the crucial organizational role in the process is to be played by art. Bogdanov forms the concept of the future proletarian culture, which is to be built as far as possible without the involvement of intelligentsia, and on the basis of the appropriation of the cultural treasures accumulated by the bourgeoisie. Quotation from him. There is only one way out. While making use of the old bourgeois culture, we need to create and disseminate in the masses a new proletarian culture, to develop proletarian science through commandership and the proletarian strata, to elaborate proletarian philosophy and to turn art towards proletarian aspiration and experience. The powerful creativity that the proletariat showed in its economical and political organization prove positive of its capacity for equally powerful cultural expression. Here we may see one of the conference of Prolet Cult Enlightenment Organization. The mixed feelings that the proletarian poets had about the cultural heritage of the past manifested themselves in the aesthetic versatility of their art, as well as in its questionable value in terms of good taste. By officially expelling anyone who has not proletarian by birth from their organizations, young poets basically deprived themselves of the opportunity to acquire proper creative writing skills. Officially proclaiming the necessity to modify the culture of the past, the prolet cult in fact advocated a full break with bourgeois heritage on all levels. At the same time, the working class poets did not shun imitation. The appropriation of cultural heritage was conducted spontaneously and not in the form of intertextual communication, like allusions to certain works of the past which would create new meanings, as was conventional for classical literary canon, but in a kind of depersonalized, purely formal way. The researcher of prolet cult artistic endeavors, Maria Levchenko, points out that the phenomenon of empty intertextuality came as a conclusion of the adhesion of the referent and the sign, life and art, as we had in case of constructivism, for example, and productivism. And it was common for many literary schools, like the same futurism and symbolism. Because of that, the text of culture are perceived by the prolet cult poets as linguistic, not literary phenomena. They use them in the same way as the words of natural language that haven't been previously loaded with any meanings. In other words, the cultural heritage of the exploiting class is reduced to the level of an inverted ready-made. Whereas Duchamp introduced industrial objects to the realm of culture, free of any aesthetic meaning, the prolet cult artist, on the contrary, aspired to find in the halls of high culture something suitable for expressing everyday life of worker. The freedom of creative expression, unheard in previous generations, only lasted for a short period of time, but provided those who treated it consciously with the opportunity to achieve incredible artistic innovations. It was at the workers' atelier studios that the experiments of Sergei Eisenstein, famous film director, or Sergei Tretyakov, writer and artist associated with constructivism and prolet cult, took shape. It was in the core journals of the prolet cult that Osip Brik and Boris Arvatov elaborated the theoretical concepts of productivism and constructivism. And lastly, it was the prolet cult correspondence work for the Pravda, Truth newspaper, that inspired Walter Benjamin to create his famous concept of the author as producer. And it's interesting to mention that Bogdanov was as well a science fiction writer, and in one of his novels he proposed a particular vision of a museum after proletarian revolution that can be comparable with what constructivists wanted to have. But in my opinion, it was an example of museum of avant-gardism, but not avant-garde museum. So we may go further. Museum of the future. The pathway of the development of museum work in the post-revolutionary period repeats the general cultural quest of the young socialist state. During this turbulent period, Lunacharsky, who was basically appointed to lead all cultural transformations, including those of the museum establishment, became a very powerful figure. In spite of his original renderings of Marxism, in this period of God building, together with Gorky and Bogdanov on Capri Island, and sympathies for the avant-garde artists and prolet cult, it is Lunacharsky, as head of the Narkom Press, People's Commissariat for Education, who has the merit of having preserved and developed the museum network, as well as that of having brought the intelligentsia to side with the new authorities. Immediately after the October Revolution, the government issued a decree on the establishment of artistic and historical commissions that had, among others, the task of revealing, registering, and transferring cultural objects of special value to the museums. In 1918, the structure of the governing bodies dealing with museum affairs was enhanced with a special unit, the State Museum Fund. This fund was responsible for the preservation, stock-taking, and distribution of collections, and a singular object of importance to museums. Besides the governing bodies, the Soviet authorities created a legislative framework facilitating the preservation of the cultural heritage. The decree of the Council of People's Commissar on the freedom of worship, church and religious societies declared all the church property to be national wealth, and the decree on the confiscation of the property of the dethroned Russian emperor and as members of the former Russian imperial house nationalized all the belongings of the Tsar and his family. An important role was played, another degree, on the prohibition of exporting and selling abroad objects of special artistic and historical value, which imposed a ban on exporting any valuables listed in it without special permission from the Council for Museum Affairs. At the Museum Conference in 1917, museums were assigned the task of providing open access not only for scientists and various professionals, but above all to the masses, to the workers. Thus, a great construction project began. Many palaces, country estates, and monasteries of cultural or historical value were turned into museum complexes. The large private collections were reorganized into public museums. By 1920, Soviet Russia already had 426 museums, including 22 in Petrograd and 38 in Moscow. The new museums emerged as well. Besides the Museum of Revolution, there appeared museum dedicated to toys, atheism, East, women liberation, many others. The very concept of the museum also underwent considerable change. It now became an important part of the state propaganda apparatus. But the methods of such propaganda were, however, rather peculiar. The Soviet museums' displays were restructured according to the new scientific principles, namely the ideas of dialectic materialism. The neutral display of the museum material was replaced with an agenda-driven position, which implies not merely an emotional effect on the viewers, but a development of their awareness of the place they occupy within the class struggle. Quotation. We do not need the museum to look like a cabinet of curiosities. We must break the routine reactionary approach to museum building. Thus present at the first All-Russian Museum Convention from 1931 that harshly criticized the old approach to display creation and proposed a series of innovations with regard to the institutional infrastructure. An ambitious task of creating the museum of the future based on scientific principles by the revolutionary proletariat was elaborated. I have some examples, and I'd like you to show some of them while I read it, and then probably we may discuss them separately. So the difficulties that came up in the work with museum collectives in most cases formed by representatives of the bourgeoisie were noted. It was suggested that as many specialists from the proletarian class as possible should be called on to work on innovative projects in museums. The delegates expressed the thought about the necessity to change the museum network as such. Thus, Ivan Lupol came up with a new classification of museum institutions based on the Marxist concept of base and superstructure. Museums were divided into separate groups: base museum, dedicated to natural science, technique, economy, and social history, and the superstructure museums, for example, artistic, anti-religious, and etc. Still, the most substantial transformations were suggested in the field of forming museum displays. According to speakers, it was necessary to discard the static approach to the presentation of material based on the display of art for the sake of art, or science for the sake of science, from concentrating on object in favor of revealing the dialectical connection between historical phenomena and the museum exhibits representing them. From a system of objects, the museum had to be turned into a system of ideas which would demonstrate not just objects, but the process. These display principles manifested themselves most widely in the experiments of the sociological school of Alexei Fyodorov-Davidov, who stood at the helm of the department of the New Russian Art at the Tretyakov Gallery in 1931-1934. The sociological display transformed the chronological display according to schools, which had prevailed all over the world up to the early 20th century, into a display according to art styles struggling with one with another. And each style should reflect a certain class position of the author. I guess what Fyodorov-Davidov did was kind of Russian or Soviet answer to Alexander Donner atmosphere room, and I don't know whether he knew about this or not, but it looks more or less comparable. But of course, in case of Fyodorov-Davidov, it was much stronger political gesture, yeah, and much more critical way of displaying works. Thus this type of display essentially represented art history through the prism of historical materialism and the class struggle. Fyodorov Davidov pointed out that museums had always shown history and art from the viewpoint of the ruling classes, and this is important suggestion. For the art institutions, this meant that the collections only contained art created by the representatives of the ruling classes, like bourgeoisie, for example, or aristocrats. Therefore, alongside art by renowned masters, each display, in case of Fyodorov Davidov, each display complex was to be enhanced with artworks which had not been recognized by the bourgeois museums as such. They may include, for instance, various functional graphic production, for example, advertisement or folk or popular prints and embroideries, plate art, and etc. And I have some quotes from him on how curators should display different historical styles together with development of class struggle. Besides material not recognized as high art, the sociological display implied the availability of extensive information of a non-artistic kind. The exhibition now contained materials on the economic situation of certain social group, geography maps, diagrams, excerpts from archival documents, advertisement, government degrees, memories, literature, etc. Besides, an important role in museum labeling was now granted to the political aspect. Political slogans were placed on the walls containing artworks from different periods, and the slogans acted as binding semantic elements within the display. Quote, "It is necessary to merely reject the beauty of hanging and be able to unite everything within one common display. One should structure the walls in such a way that the slogan material would bear the function not of simple labels, but of a bridge connecting different objects to that paintings plus slogans, inscriptions, and posters would bring about a unified wall composition." In this respect, in order to study the transformations of the artistic forms in art history more profoundly, the display was supplemented with special theory rooms that dealt with the defined categories of the perception of visual art, like space, color, and form. In keeping with sociological guidelines, the department of the Tretьяков Gallery were renamed and restructured. The departments as such were replaced with sections covering the periods of feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. The year 1931 saw a large-scale revamping of the displays in the gallery halls. Art history presented from the viewpoint of class struggle was now assembled in the exhibition entitled the Experimental Complex Marxist Exhibition as a gigantic total installation. Artworks of the past were deprived of the independent value and defetized by means of placing them in the context of their actual habitation. But of course it was kind of a reconstruction of this. Paintings were presented in the typical interiors of their possible owners, reflecting different periods and different class positions. The art of oppressed, folk architecture, art by amateur authors, etc. was exhibited separately. The exhibition was also supplemented with special info stands and again a lot of information that was not just art itself. And I just shortly mentioned some other examples. For example, Leningrad Museum of the Revolution, and here we have Dynamite Workshop, which is unbelievable for contemporary museum standards. Why not? But not as spatial construction, but as methodology, probably. So, mobile laboratory one and the agitprop truck, which is maybe more known. Art of Nomad women. Liberation of Azerbaijan women. Leningrad Museum of the Atheism, with a fantastic suprematist design of the exhibition. And another example of anti-religious museum. And on the wall we may read, give more coal, iron, steel, machines instead of gods and relics, more tractors in the village. And below on the banner, religion is the opium of the people. And this is a good moment to start a new part of my presentation, Life After Death. And I guess this is the main interesting thing that we may discuss as human beings. And as we all know that death of art was crucial topic and crucial method for modernism of 20th century, because each new art movement usually started with killing of previous one, and there are many examples of it, but I would like to mention shortly a poet associated with futuristic movement and prolet cult movement, Vasily Gnedov, who had already declared the death of art in the collection of his poems even before Black Square. And it was a collection of 15 poems, and each new was a little bit shorter than previous one, and finally the 15th was just empty page. And what was even more interesting that he performed these poems and performed a final one with just like crossing gesture by his hand, and then I left the stage. But it's kind of like endless crime, endless killing of art. But what is probably more interesting is life after death, not just killing. And this is important to discuss in the case of post-revolutionary avant-garde, because after revolution it was not logical for artists to continue killing art or make provocation against their audience, because audience was already like proletariat, yeah? Like previously oppressed class that tried to find its own path to the culture. And there was strong necessity to find another way to work with cultural heritage. And as we know, there were several suggestions. And one of the most radical of them was proposed by constructivist and productivist movement, and especially by its theorist Boris Arvatov. Unfortunately, I guess he's still less known, and even in Russia. And just recently, one of his important texts was translated into English, so I hope it will allow people to know more about this figure. So Boris Arvantev points out that the society where all social contradictions between productive forces and productive relations overcome has no place for the highly specialized niche of art. So it's kind of particular way of interpretation of Marxism, which on the one hand seems logical, but on the other hand it's not such evident thing. And this position was criticized even during his lifetime. And I guess for such type of Marxist interpretation, Arvatev went through influence of Alexander Bogdanov technology and probably debates on life creation that provoked Russian cosmist philosophers and symbolist poet of Russian Silver Age. And according to Arvatev, even in such high advanced society, communist society, traditional mediums will survive because even communists will have bodies, and because of that will die and have sexual relationships. And this is typical traumas that feed traditional paintings and sculptures. But it's interesting to mention that another conception of museum starts from this point, and this conception associated with Russian cosmism. I'm not going to speak more about it, I just want to mention it. And what was important for my today text is that Soviet museums went to almost opposite direction. Yes, because they didn't have this demand to go beyond limits of art, because museums were already kind of part of life. So what they did, they tried to go in direction of producing art exhibition as a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, as a kind of great art piece in between life and art. And in this gesture they were really close to what prolet cult poets and artists tried to do with ready-made of bourgeois culture that was used only for utilitarian needs of contemporary expression. We may go further to the last section that calls Vulgar freedom of museum work. And here I'd like to show you some reconstructions, very artistic reconstructions that I did together with Museum of American Art Berlin as part of Center for Experimental Museology. And this is reconstruction of Alexey Fyodorov-Davidov exhibit on Malevich. So experimentation with museum displays did not last long, and neither did the activities of the prolet cult or productivist artists and many other post-revolutionary art collectives. The wave of repression that swept, among others, creative workers did not spare museum staff either. Many of those who spoke at the first All-Russian Museum Convention were sent to Stalinist camps. The experimental complex exhibition at the Department for New Art of the Tretyakov Gallery was shut down, and its initiator, Fyodorov-Davidov, was expelled from the institution. The vulgar freedom of creative quest of the 1920s was replaced by the party doctrine of socialist realism. The historical, chronological and thematic approaches were rehabilitated. The value of the object of the museum exhibit as an undisputed center of the museum display was no longer doubted. The concept of transcending the limits of art became subject to criticism as outdated leftist extremes that it would be impossible to realize under current historical conditions. And in other example, in museum studies, especially in Russia, it is still pointed out that the provisions of the first museum convention had a destructive impact on museum affairs in the USSR. The primary concern was that the museums would lose their authenticity, which consisted in the thematic display of museum exhibits, in the moment towards more and more artificial displays subject to narrative. The indignation of museologists is easily understood. Indeed, turning the museum into a work of conceptual art would have been an extraordinary event not only for socialist realism, but also for the Western artistic quest of those days and years. And today the ideas of vulgar socialism, it was special labor invented by Stalinist theoreticians for sociological approach. And prolet cult, vulgar socialism and the prolet cult workers, the representatives of socialist school of museum display, were charged with still sound horrible for most intellectuals, and I will explain later. This. The creative expression of the artist, as was pointed out by Soviet aesthetic theory after the manner of Marx, is able to overcome strict social determinism. Because Fedorov-Davidov approach was based on the conclusion that there is strict line between your own social position, class-based position, and your creative expression. And it's not such an easy interpretation, and Marx already wrote a lot on this simplification in order to avoid this simplification. As for the relations between the economic base and the cultural superstructure, there is no linear dependence between them. At the same time, this doesn't cancel the unquestionable fact that the activities pursued by most cultural producers do not go beyond the limits of the average norm. And however banal it may be, they will always be subjected to the dogmas of their own class and historical origin. Already during the lifetime of the founders of critical theory, there were plenty of writers who, in spite of their socialist aspirations, could not go much further than praising the fabric pipe. Still, there were also plenty of those who, in spite of the reactionary views, followed their artistic genius and created sublime and progressive works of art. And there is a good example of Balzac, who had reactionary political views, and of course was not representative of proletarian class, but through his artistic practice express very important things for even Marxist movement. So probably, maybe now the time come to discard the cliches of the past, both of the left and right, and soberly evaluate the cultural fruits that were burned by the young Soviet states. Let us ask ourselves, did not the experimentation belonging to the sociological school of museum display fall into the same trap of fallacy that they tried to ensnare the art of the past in? If the value of creative revelations was denied in favor of sociological context of its origin, why then should not the artistic museum experiment be relegated to oblivion based on a false interpretation of Marxism-Leninism? But the uniqueness of the artistic solution suggested by Fedorov and Davidov group, in my mind, very important, because long before emergence of critical installation practice or institutional critique or formation of conceptual art or post-colonial series that allow to show works of oppressed classes. We had an example of it in 1930s. And people who even did not call themselves artists or curators create a work of art with super important for further development. And I would suggest that avant-garde character of the art created by Soviet museologists must be reopened to the world in spite of the critique of official Soviet bureaucracy and the silence of the Western colleagues who considered that the Soviet experiments of the 1920s and 30s had gone too far beyond the institutional borders of art. Thank you.